the Draft Home Detention Curfew and Requisite and Minimum Custodial Periods Amendment Order 2024.
I call the Minister to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairing. I beg to move that the committee consider the Draft Home Detention Curfew and Requisite and Minimum Custodial Periods Amendment Order 2024. The Government laid this draft order on the 13th of November, and I hope that has given honourable members an opportunity to scrutinise the order and its accompanying explanatory documents. However, I welcome this further opportunity today to be clear about what the order will do and the Government's reasons for taking these measures. This draft order is a key part of our continuing efforts to resolve the capacity crisis in our prisons. We inherited a prison system on the verge of collapse from the previous government, and on the 12th of July the Lord Chancellor was forced to announce a measure to address the immediate risk of running out of prison places. This was a change to modify the automatic release point for those serving standard determinate sentences from 50% to 40%. Specified offences were excluded from this modification. The draft order before us now makes further important changes to that original measure by excluding a number of further offences from this modification. Also, as part of our continuing efforts to avoid running out of prison spaces, the order amends the provisions relating to home detention curfew, or HDC, by extending the maximum time that an offender can spend on HDC in the community. HDC enables eligible risk-assessed offenders to be released from prison 6 months early and spend more time in the community. They are subject to an electronically monitored curfew. We are proposing to extend the maximum time that an offender can spend on HDC from 6 to 12 months. To be clear, Mr Mundell, we seek to extend the maximum curfew period only. Eligibility and suitability criteria remain exactly the same. All the exclusions remain. For example, sex offenders are still excluded in statute, and those serving sentences linked to domestic abuse remain presumed unsuitable under the policy. It is right that the sentencing review is given time to do its work, but the capacity crisis in our prisons has not gone away. When we introduced emergency measures in July, we believed that they had brought us about a year. But after the summer of disorder, the next crisis could be just 9 months away. And for that reason, we must implement further measures urgently to ensure we do not face running out of places again. The change to HDC will help to ensure that the criminal justice system is able to function as it should, helping to prevent further acute capacity pressures and avoid running out of prison places, which would cause criminal justice gridlock. This draft order relates to release measures within the Criminal Justice Act 2003. The first part of the draft order deals with the home detention curfew, or HDC. HDC has been in operation since 1999. The scheme enables certain prisoners to be released from prison early, whilst remaining subject to significant restrictions to their liberty. Offenders who are released from custody on this basis are tagged and placed on a curfew. This curfew must be for at least 9 hours per day by law, but generally around 12 hours per day as a matter of policy. The curfew requirement must remain in force until they reach what would have been the conditional or automatic release date. Those released on HDC are subject to probation supervision and other restrictions as necessary. These may include GPS location and alcohol monitoring, exclusion zones, non-contact conditions and travel restrictions. If offenders breach the terms of their conditions, they can be recalled to custody to serve the remainder of their custodial sentence. The rules on eligibility will not change as a result of this draft order. Offenders must complete half of the custodial part of their sentence before they can be considered eligible for HDC. Release on HDC is also entirely discretionary. There are a number of offences that are excluded from its scope by statute, for example, serious, violent and all sexual offences. Other types of offending are presumed unsuitable as a matter of policy, including those often associated with domestic abuse such as stalking, harassment and coercive control. Offenders serving sentences for any of the presumed unsuitable offences will not be considered for release unless the prison governor is satisfied that there are exceptional circumstances justifying this. Any offenders who meet this test will still be subject to a rigorous risk assessment process before release on HDC is approved. We're proposing to change the maximum period that is eligible prisoner may spend on HDC. We plan to extend this to 6 months from the current maximum, to extend this to 12 months from the current maximum of 6 months. These offenders eligible for HDC will continue to be risk assessed and will still be subject to strict licence conditions and an electronically monitored curfew. As the previous Prisons Minister said, the reoffending rate for prisoners released directly from custody was close to 50%, but for the types of offenders released on HDC, it was 23%. The previous administration committed to doing a review when HDC was extended from 4.5 months to 6 months. This review did not take place, and the growing crisis in our prisons has meant that we need to take further action. HDC is very closely monitored by HMPPS and the MOJ. Data on releases and recalls is regularly published. This will continue. I must be clear that this measure is urgently needed to reduce the pressure on the prison system. The challenges facing us across the prison estate are such that we must take urgent action to allow the sentencing review to take place. By extending HDC, we are using a long-standing mechanism that has robust safeguards built into it. The order will also amend the Criminal Justice Act 2003 Requisite and Minimum Custodial Periods Order 2024, which established the SDS 40 early release measure by modifying the automatic release point for those serving standard determinant sentences from 50% to 40%. This SI seeks to exclude 6 further offences from the early release measure which were not identified at the time. SDS 40 was delivered extremely effectively, but there was a problem with 37 prisoners who were released in error. This issue involved the use of an offence that had been repealed in 2020, thereby creating an anomaly. That ultimately meant that these prisoners were not identified as being ineligible for early release under SDS 40. All of these offenders released in error were returned to custody. Subsequently, a thorough search uncovered similar anomalies where legislation creating criminal offences had been repealed and replaced. We had already taken the decision to exclude such offending which relates to stalking, harassment, sexual harm and so-called revenge pornography from the scope of emergency early release. We are therefore acting quickly to exclude 5 further offences from SDS 40. This will include anyone convicted of any of these offences that they cannot be released early under SDS 40, as well as ensuring that the spirit of the original exclusions is delivered in full. The draft order also excludes murder from SDS 40. Ordinarily, that would not be any need to exclude murder, as anyone convicted of murder under English law receives a mandatory life sentence. However, some jurisdictions do not have life sentences, so it is possible in a very small number of cases that a UK national convicted of murder in a foreign jurisdiction may be given a determinate sentence for murder by that foreign court and may then be repatriated back to the UK to serve that sentence in a prison in England and Wales. We want to ensure that no offender in this position could be released early under SDS 40. Shortly after coming to power, the government took decisive action to stop our prisons from collapsing. SDS 40 was an emergency response to the crisis that we were faced with. We worked at pace to ensure that the scheme was as effective as possible, while also protecting the public by excluding the most serious offenders and providing specific protections for victims of certain domestic abuse offences. We have kept SDS 40 under constant review and will continue to do so, and we are now acting quickly to address a small number of anomalies in the original legislation. The draft order extends to England and Wales only, and there should be no direct effect on the devolved administrations. Thank you, Mr Mundell.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that the committee has considered the draft Home Detention Curfew and Requisite and Minimum Custodial Periods Amendment Order 2024. I call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Mundell. I want to begin by saying that the remarks by the Minister were to be expected. They're in keeping with the trend across government of defending decision after decision taken by them by reference to our record and actions in office. This is the nature of politics, and I imagine it's going to continue for some time. But I'm certainly not going to be writing any blank cheque to the Minister and the government and abdicate our duty to hold them responsible and accountable, whatever they might say about their inheritance. It's our role to deliver scrutiny, not just of the overall outcomes they're seeking, but how they're going about it. Whilst the government's intent to address prison capacity pressures is clear, we must critically assess whether these measures have been properly considered, that we can expect them to be delivered competently, and when looked at in detail, match up to the pledges they're making about them. Our prison system faces unprecedented strain. All the evidence is that this strain has become the challenge we see today primarily because of COVID. If the remand population that has spiked directly because of COVID were at historical levels, we would not be here. And so we're left with 7,000 more people in our prisons than we would normally have when looking at the historical average. Members will know this sum is greater than the numbers the government has been and will be going on to release to reduce the steady-state prison population. The previous government, like this one, sought ways to manage this challenge. This included the use of the end of custody licence scheme, a scheme which, as they have criticised it, members opposite should be aware was actually created by the last Labour government. The previous government also had planned to change legislation to allow us to accommodate prisoners overseas and to discourage use of shorter sentences. And this government has, of course, decided to take its own measures. This began, as we've heard, with the SDS 40 scheme, and now it proposes to extend home detention curfew eligibility from 180 to 365 days. We're told that both of these measures are short-term measures, that the impact of these steps has been fully understood, and that, of course, there should be some acceptance that the government will deliver these mechanisms effectively. Let me begin with the proposition that these are short-term measures, or as the Minister liked to call them, urgent. I'll make the same point I made to the Lord Chancellor in the Chamber when it came to SDS 40. If these measures are expected to be short-term measures, why have they not been sunsetted? If you're confident that these are only short-term, then make them short-term in the legislation. The government has not even gone so far as to tell us what the threshold will be for when they will review possible withdrawal. To be at least fair to the Labour government, even they did that. When they introduced end of custody licence, they set a target of prison capacity, a fixed figure at which they would review its use, and that is what's happened. This government has not even done that. And of course, as is so often the case, the devil is in the detail, or to be more precise in this instance, in the impact assessment. Why, if this is a short-term measure, is the impact measuring its benefit over 10 years? It's there in black and white on page 7 of the impact assessment. You cannot expect the opposition to support measures that you say are short-term when all the evidence is that they are not. Next, I will come on to whether we have the necessary assurance that they have properly considered the impact of their policy. I'm afraid, again, the Minister and members of the committee will need to reflect on their own impact assessment to assist them with this. Page 4 helpfully lays out those that will be affected by this policy. Quite rightly, at paragraph 13, it lays out that the victims of those released from custody should be included in this group. I'm sure everyone here can agree that female victims of male violence, people that have been burgled, people that have been mugged, are impacted when they see the perpetrator walk away from prison early. And if members turn to page 10 at the back, paragraph 56 summarises the impact assessment. It says, we've taken into account the potential impact of the earlier release of some offenders on the public, and particularly victims of the offenders released. Well, I'm afraid the Minister will need to help me here. Forgive me, but where exactly in the pages between 4 and 10 has the government done that? Extraordinarily, it talks about how much better it will be for the perpetrators and their families to be reunited, but what about victims and their families? Besides a cursory mention of notifying them that this will be happening, and what impact this will have on them, it says absolutely nothing. Nothing. And then finally, we come to effective delivery, where we might look to make an assessment of this. Of course, we didn't look any further than this legislation, because as well as expanding the HDC scheme, as the Minister has said, today's legislation is also correcting errors in the SDS 40 scheme. This amendment rightly excludes 6 additional offences missing from the SDS 40 scheme, ensuring those convicted serve at least half their sentence. How do they initially overlook offences such as breaching restraining orders, sexual harm prevention orders and serious harassment? These are not minor offences, they carry significant harm, particularly for victims. And the Minister may shake his head and say in some ways they were captured, but ultimately, as he's admitted, offenders have been released that should not have been released. And ultimately, this will also change significantly the number of electronic monitoring tags required. The framework acknowledges this, but it fails to detail how the government will ensure readiness. We've seen what happens when these systems fail. Under the SDS 40 early release scheme, offenders were released without tags, posing a clear danger to the public. We're told that they're now up to date with the SDS 40 scheme. Can the Minister tell us what the situation is with the wider backlog? I'm afraid the government has not done enough to reassure us that yet further extensions to the use of tagging at this stage are going to be suitably managed. The Lord Chancellor has also committed to funding at least 1,000 additional probation officers by March 2025. The recruitment and training of probation officers takes time. What evidence have we got that this target is going to be met? To conclude, I'm afraid on these three sensible tests against which we might view this policy, the result is wanting. They want to talk about our record. I remind them they steered our courts to an even higher Crown Court backlog than the one we reduced it to pre-pandemic. They criticise us. The Minister frowns, he can look it up. Pre-pandemic, the backlog was lower than the backlog you left us at the end of your time in government. And they criticise us for several thousand prisoners. They say we forced them to release early. Perhaps members opposite don't know that they released more than 80,000 prisoners early when they were last in charge. There's no doubt there are challenges in our criminal justice system, but they should not expect and will not receive a free pass when it comes to fulfilling their responsibilities to tackle that challenge with professionalism and due diligence. The public expect better than this and will be voting against this afternoon on their behalf.
Lib Dem spokesman Josh Babarindi.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the Minister for outlining his remarks and what we've got before us here. I also thank him and the government for taking seriously the issue of addressing overcrowding in our prisons. The government inherited a position that was completely unsustainable, a position where our prisons have been driven to the brink by the last government. It's clear that urgent action was needed. I'm concerned, though, and so are Liberal Democrats, about the implications of the SDS 40 scheme and its administration of it thus far on the victims and survivors of domestic abuse. The Minister will be aware of this because I've mentioned it in the Chamber many, many times and also in private meetings too. It's welcome that the scheme or that this order will seek to tighten up loopholes in that scheme by including excluding perpetrators of 6 different offences here, whether it's breaches of restraining orders, breaches of sexual harm prevention orders, breaching of stalking protection orders, revenge porn, and indeed murderers who were convicted in other jurisdictions. But a key concern is that these are coming in now after the release of several thousand individuals, some of whom may fall into these categories. What I want to know, what survivors of domestic abuse need to know is how many people who have breached these various orders, who are perpetrators here, how many of them have already been released. Secondly, of those who have already been released, if the number is more than 0, and my assumption is that it may well be, how many of them does the government intend to recall? If the government is now saying that actually these people should not be on our streets, that they should be behind bars, continuing their punishment and continuing robust rehabilitation. I also want to ask the Minister how he and the government came to the conclusion that these 6 offences and no further ones were to be considered as further exclusions. What consultation has the Minister done and has the government done to understand from groups in the sector, whether it's the likes of Refuge, Women's Aid, there are so many more that I've been engaging with. What consultation has the government done to understand the effectiveness of these additional 6 offences and whether there ought to be any more? Does he have plans to further consult with those groups who are incredibly concerned about this situation as well? In addition to this, a key concern that many victims and survivors groups have is over the interaction between the SDS 40 scheme and the victim contact scheme. It's critical for victims and survivors to know that if and when their abuser is to be let out, whether early or not, that it has happened. It's important for them to be able to prepare for what life will be like after that moment. As it stands, the victim contact scheme only kicks in if a perpetrator has been sentenced for 12 months or longer. We know that there are many abusers, including those convicted of common assault, who are in prison for less than that amount of time, and therefore they do not fall under the victim contact scheme. Refuge and many other organisations that I've engaged with like them have been pushing the government to expand that victim contact scheme to include victims and survivors of all abusers, no matter how long their sentence is. And I want to push the Minister and the government on that again today. This government and the Secretary of State in particular, in the Chamber and beyond, has given assurances to victims and survivors of domestic abuse that it will keep them safe. But unfortunately, that has not been the case so far. We've seen that through the loopholes that the government left the first and second time round, and more assurances are required from this government in order for survivors of domestic abuse to feel safe in the context of this scheme that has been brought about as a result of the last government's maladministration of our prison system. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Mundell.
Thank you. Minister, to respond to the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Mundell. Can I first of all thank the Liberal Democrat spokesman for recognising right at the start of his contribution that the government is taking this very seriously. And to just remark on the comments from the official opposition about the official opposition is absolutely right not to give the government a free pass. The public expect better, they say. But bear in mind, this scheme, the scheme that we're putting in place, does exclude people convicted of sexual offences, whilst the scheme that his government put in place, the scheme that the government of which you were a member put in place, did not put any exclusions in place at all. And they were done hurriedly just before the election, whilst these are being done in a crisis, to respond to a crisis, to take control of the prison population so that we can actually run a criminal justice scheme appropriately. If the government that preceded us has done its job properly, we would have inherited a situation which we could build on positively into the future, and sadly that's not been the case. So let me pick up the issues that have been rightly raised. I'll deal with the Liberal Democrat spokesman's issues first in terms of victims. We take the issue of victims and victims' voices very, very seriously, and will continue to do so. Anyone convicted of offences linked to domestic abuse, such as stalking and harassment, are presumed unsuitable for HDC. Exclusions under SDS 40 have to be based on specific offences, and domestic abusers are prosecuted under many grounds. Our exclusions send a very clear message about how seriously the government takes domestic abuse. And unlike the ECSL scheme, we've specifically taken action here, and we will continue to do everything we can in terms of ensuring that the victim's voice is very well represented in all these issues. Victims eligible for the victim notification scheme or victim contact scheme are properly informed in the process. That is taking place. And obviously the sentencing review will be looking at other things. We've made sure that there's a victim's voice on the panel that's taking forward that sentencing review. So the Shadow Minister, going to the issues he rightly raised, he raised the issue of the electronic monitoring system and whether that's doing the job effectively. Again, we inherited a contract from the previous government which was not performing to the level we would have wished, but you know, it is improving, but it's still not where we want it to be. It is up to a particular point that we're confident it can handle this additional workload that's coming forward, but we will need to continue to work hard to make sure that the contractors deliver as they should always have been delivering. We shouldn't have inherited a situation where they weren't performing to the state that they should do. And he asked about when this SDS 40 would be reviewed. As the Lord Chancellor, when he raised this in the Chamber, assured him that it would be reviewed after 18 months, and that would come back to Parliament at that point. So I do hope, having had this discussion, that the committee will support... I'll give way.
Thank you for him answering, I think, one of my questions. Could he perhaps address the 10-year timescale in the impact assessment? The lack of anything discussing victims in the impact assessment? I think there were two other points that you could usefully try and reply to.
Well, as he probably realises, all impact assessments look at a 10-year focus. So that impact assessment is nothing to do with intention. It's about impact if things went on for that period of time. It is the normal process. So that he is confusing impact assessment with government intention. The government intention is not for this to continue for that period of time.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Home Detention Curfew and Requisite and Minimum Custodial Periods Amendment Order 2024. As many as that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no.
No.
Division.
Division room 9.
Lock the doors. Now, just to advise, if the division takes place in the House of Commons, before we have completed this division, I will have to suspend proceedings and we will have to come back and redo the division. So,
Jazz Athwell. Josh Babarinde. David Baines. Sir Nicholas Dakin.
Aye.
Marsha de Cordova.
Aye.
Tracy Gilbert.
Aye.
Sally Jameson.
Aye.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
No.
Jack Rankin.
No.
Tim Rocker.
Aye.
Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
No.
David Simmons.
No. I think there might be a couple missing still.
the ayes were 8 and the noes were 4, so the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Order, order.